Hello, everyone. This is a presentation about Beyond the Pleasure Principle by Defna, Ellie, Marissa, and Michael. Okay, first, a quick background about this theory. When it was first published, critics has not failed to point out the lack of clinical experience, and Freud surprisingly openly admitted that there are many speculations uh, in this theory. However, he believes that these are unavoidable speculations that we need in such an uncharted field. You need to understand that he was entering a new field that no one had ever entered before. So, anyway, let's now together explore this fantastic realm of pleasure, reality, and death that Mr. Freud had created for us.
Hi everyone, so the first part of the presentation will be about the pleasure principle versus the reality principle. And I wanted to start off by talking about the tone of Freud, which in my point of view was pretty significant. So in the introduction of the first part of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud states that he is standing beside his theory of the pleasure principle, now more than ever actually. From his tone we can understand that what he has discovered now, what is to come in the next section of the writing, does not falsify his former one, the pleasure principle. Instead, it acknowledges it as a base. So, pleasure and unpleasure. The human mind, when faced with something that causes distress or unpleasure, tries to find a way out of it, which is, in my point of view, really interesting. It either tries to avoid it by turning away or tries to find something pleasurable out of it. Unpleasure leads to an increase in the quantity of excitation, and pleasure leads to a decrease. The mind's aim is to keep the quantity as low as possible or as constant as possible. So, as you can see in the slide, the pleasure principle is the instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain, the driving force guiding the id. The reality principle, on the other hand, is the ability of the mind to assess the external world and act under the influence of the ego's instincts of self-preservation. Self-preservation is the key word here. So the reality principle is the first of the two sources of unpleasure. The reality principle, as Freud states, does not abandon the intention of ultimately obtaining pleasure, it just kind of postpones the satisfaction of pleasure. The reality principle demands self-control. And the pleasure principle often succeeds in overcoming the reality principle in real life, as one is not always in worry of preserving itself. So the second of the two sources of unpleasure is the instinct in the conscious, unconscious that surface. So this was actually the part that I had the most trouble with. So if you guys had the same, I'm going to try to explain what it means. So repression is actually a source of pleasure, which was really interesting to me. And while the ego is developing, the energy in the ego arises from its innate instinctual impulses. And some of the instinct's intentions clash with others, thus leading to the repression of the remaining ones. If the repressed instincts manage to struggle through from the unconscious into the conscious, what would normally be pleasurable is felt by the ego as unpleasure. I'm still confused by it, so if one of you understands it, please explain it to me, but I tried my best to. So there are two kinds of perceptual unpleasure. First is internal, and the second is external, as you can read here. The second part of the presentation will be about traumatic neurosis. A condition has long been known and described which occurs after several mechanical concussions, railway disasters, and the other accidents involving a risk to life, which is the key word here. It has been given the name of traumatic neurosis. I try to make a graph for you to understand better the comparisons and contrasts between hysteria and traumatic neurosis. I hope it helps. So as you can see here, the two characteristics of traumatic neurosis is first, the factor of surprise of fright, which is key, and a wound or injury inflicted simultaneously works as a rule against the development of neurosis. In his writing, Freud mentions three words that are often confused: anxiety, fright, and fear. So here are the definitions of the three words, and my question is, do you think that anxiety can produce a traumatic neurosis? As you know, in anxiety, you know what's going to come, you're prepared for it. Even if it's something unknown, you're prepared for it. So, yeah, that's my question. Here's another question. It is argued that the function of dreaming is corrupted by this traumatic neurosis. The dreams of the patient are no longer ones that fulfill or reflect their wishes. So my question is, do you think this is true, or can this be one of the mysteries of the masochistic trance of the ego? So in this slide you can see the majority of what's being explored in this part of the text, which is the children's play of Disappearance and Return, and you can read what I try to describe, what I try to summarize of the stages. So the question is, what should we understand from this part of the text? For me, I got three understandings. The first being repetition of the unpleasant experience, his mother leaving, is in his game done because it resulted in pleasure ultimately. Second is children repeat everything they made that made an impression on them in their real lives, because in doing so they try to make themselves the master of that situation, and in their minds they're trying to be grown up and trying to understand what's going on around them and try to interpret them. And the third is something that I had seen before, but I didn't know what it actually was, which is the repetition compulsion. So it is painful to recognize the unpleasant past, but it is necessary to unlock the doors of the unconscious in psychoanalysis, so repetition compulsion is actually needed. And finally, here's something extra I wanted to share with you, since I am really into art.
Hi, I'm Marissa, and I'm going to be talking about part 3 and 4, which I chose to title The Repetition Compulsion and Trauma in the Mind. So regarding repetition compulsion, or part 3, Freud stated that psychoanalysis relies on making the unconscious of a patient conscious during his talking therapy sessions. And since it would be impossible for them to remember everything, specifically traumatic parts of the memory that they may have chosen to forget, or maybe just childhood events that are now unclear to them, the patient must repeat the events or the traumatic event that they're trying to remember over and over in their mind. This repetition may actually lead to something called transference neurosis, and so the psychologist must balance this neurosis with aloofness, which is basically allowing the patient to stay grounded in reality and realize that it's not affecting them right now. So Freud also talked about the unconscious repressed versus the coherent ego. So the ego works under the pleasure principle because it's logical and it wants to seek the most pleasurable events as possible. However, the mind wants to repeat the repressed traumatic memories, as kind of like how he was talking about for the talking therapy. And so this compulsion to repeat non-pleasurable events overrides the pleasure principle, because these events had never given the patient or the person suffering from neurosis pleasure in the first place, and they technically have no reason to repeat it, but for some reason they still have this compulsion to do so. However, Freud mentioned that the repetition compulsion cannot actually be proved, but he did mention multiple examples of this compulsion being apparent in many of his patients, including people who have multiple affairs or betray multiple of their friends, and a lot of events of that sort. So some of my thoughts on this are that it's kind of difficult to accept this idea because there's such a lack of evidence for it. But I understand that it would be pretty much impossible to find any sort of concrete evidence for this, for such a abstract idea. So I think the fact that he was able to provide so many examples, and I can see that they are logical, I think that convinced me that this is something that I believe in. Okay, so moving on to part 4, which I chose to title Trauma in the Mind. So Freud began this part of his essay talking about the structure of the mind, specifically how consciousness is part of this system called a system of perception consciousness. And so excitatory processes that occur externally are conscious in the system of C's, but their traces are not stored there, which basically means that we're conscious of this event when it happens, but they're not stored in our memory consciously. And so when this protective barrier of system C's is broken by a stimulus, it's considered to be traumatic. And in this case, the pleasure principle is overridden. And when this barrier is broken, an anticathexis is set up in the mind in order to contest this invasion and bind it physically or convert it from a free flowing cathexis into a quiescent cathexis. And this action diminishes the energy from other psychological functions by, yeah. And then higher quiescent cathexis have a greater binding force. So when a traumatic event enters a lower level quiescent cathexis and is binded there, it's more likely to be traumatic. And Freud also said in his essay that dreams are independent from the pleasure principle because dreams that involve trauma are not related to wish fulfillment, but instead are related to the repetition compulsion. Specifically, these dreams involve childhood traumatic memories or occurred during a traumatic time. So my thoughts on this were that Freud contradicting the wish fulfillment quality of dreams was one of the contents of this essay that most surprised me, since he was so intent on it and he published his interpretation of dreams, which talked so much about it. Um, but yeah, and I also thought that this was probably one of the hardest readings to understand. But this was just my perspective of this part of the essay.
Okay, so this is the last section of this chapter, section 7. To me, this is kind of like a conclusion and elevation of what Freud has discussed before and above, of course. I call it a new starting point. It's a quote from a sentence from the original article that Freud wrote. The sentence was like this: "Here might be the fresh starting point for fresh investigations." And how is that? Basically, the conclusion that Mr. Freud reached at the end of the day is a very simple one. At the beginning of mental life, the struggle for pleasure was far more intense than later, but not so unrestricted, because it had to submit to frequent interruptions. And in later times, the dominance of the pleasure principle is very much more secure, but itself has no more escaped the process of taming than the other instincts in general. So, yeah, this sounds like a pretty perfect ending, but not to Mr. Freud. He believes this is a very fresh starting point for new investigations because, to be honest, from the original article,